I make a distinction between the shadow government and the deep state. The shadow government would be the CIA and its manipulation of our elected government, Congress, the White House, and the judiciary. The deep state are these massive military industrial contractors and what I call the secret intelligence industrial complex that literally set foreign policy for the United States on behalf of the CIA with their CIA contracts and their military industrial complex contracts. That's the deep state, in my view, in conjunction with the Department of State and other things that are running an unelected government and setting foreign policy with no input from the American people.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show.
I want to get into it. All these things that I've been thinking about as I've looked at the media these past few years, and I think to myself, man, that is crazy. How could that happen? You address all those things in this book, and it makes sense. You connect the dots that how the CIA is sort of, everybody always wonders who was really running things. And your point is the CIA and others potentially linked within the government or media to the CIA have been essentially running things for the past 60 years.
Yes, I think in basic and factually that is entirely the case. And there's plenty of evidence out there that clearly indicates that. And of course, we have got, as you know, a lot of footnotes in the book with some of the research that we did.
Yeah, I want to get to the Bob Woodward story because that's fascinating.
Sure.
But I want to start off with something you peripherally mentioned it, particularly in the beginning, but you don't really address it that much. During the BLM protests, do you remember when Seattle, like portions of Seattle were just taken over, and the area was called the Chaz or the Chad. And then afterwards, nobody, they basically quarantined off this whole area, the activists, and you weren't allowed in, and they were running things. And I remember when one teenager died because they wouldn't let the ambulance through because the ambulance had to be accompanied by police.
Right.
So there was this was a seriously bad thing. And when they threatened to kind of take over the neighborhood where the mayor lived, she said, nope, that's the end of it. And they cleared it all out. But nobody went to jail. Like the main guy running it, the Chaz area, was selling like merchandise, like merch on his online store afterwards. How come this was allowed to happen and no one went to jail? Like, doesn't that seem insane to you?
Well, it is insane, but I think, in my opinion, I understand why. Back in 1994, when DEI came into the CIA and they ordered us, no one could say Merry Christmas or have manger scenes or anything. And it's very progressive ideology. And it's the progressive ideology that is being promulgated through the news media, especially, that you are not to question any minority group or ethnic group or groups such as that, what they do. You are not to question that because DEI, unfortunately, is now kind of a ruling entity. And I saw it in the government starting in 1994 in the CIA. And of course, it's prevails throughout our entire government. So I think the Biden administration, without question, heavily leans towards DEI. And so that's why more wasn't done about that.
I mean, is this a DEI thing or an insanity thing? They let basically like a bunch of, like, forgetting all about like race and BLM, which was supposedly the underlying movement. Like they just let a bunch of people take over part of a city and have their own rule of law running things.
Yeah.
And then nobody got prosecuted afterwards. Like I can't imagine. I could never in the prior 40 or 50 years imagine something like that happening. It happened in like a part of like Portland, it happened in some other cities too, but nothing like Seattle. Yeah. And I just always wondered, like, why didn't anybody go to jail? Like kids died even. And like the same thing, like in St. Louis, there was all these riots and a police officer, an African-American former police officer got shot and killed during one of the riots.
Oh, yeah.
And it was just insane what was going on and why. It doesn't even matter. Like, I don't care about like, okay, the underlying movement had important messages and people should listen. But then what happened clearly, I mean, I even spoke to Eric Adams, who was about to be mayor of New York. And he's like, this is not activists. This is a professional outfit of criminals that are really kind of behind a lot of this. Was the CIA kind of involved at all?
No, I don't think the CIA was involved in that at all. I think it was kind of the progressive mandates in the government that kept from prosecuting any of the people that actually did legitimate crimes. I think that came down from the progressive leaning of the government not to prosecute people in that particular movement. And it is, you're absolutely right. It's total insanity. I like to tell my wife, if something is happening and it defies common sense or it defines logic, something else is up.
Yeah, you mentioned that exact theory in the book, and I like it. Like, what were some incidents that were in the news where you're like, huh?
Epstein was a prime example. I knew Epstein was a CIA operative going way back when that whole thing started, just by looking at all the case facts and how he wasn't prosecuted. And then they didn't prosecute him because they were ordered that he was quote unquote intelligence, and then they dropped it and he walked, and they continued to do that sort of thing. The CIA's hands were all over that. He was a CIA asset, and he was a Mossad asset. So there's an example.
Now, how do you know for sure? Like, do you actually know, or is this like people told you because they knew, or you just think this looked like?
It's reported out there, and I'm trying to remember the district attorney, the state attorney at the time. He was later promoted to a cabinet level position, I believe. He made the statement, and you can Google this and find it. Why didn't you prosecute or put Epstein in jail the first time? And his quote was, and you can look this up, "We were told by intelligence not to touch him." That quote is out there. It's been documented and verified a few times that he made that statement. And of course, the head of Israel was photographed visiting his residence, and you put all those facts together, and especially the quote, there's no question. The evidence is out there. If you Google it and Google that Epstein's first case, you'll see it. And me knowing how intelligence works and how the blackmail operation works and how Mossad and the CIA work together, that's how I knew initially that he was being used as an asset.
What was the plan, do you think? Like, so they have all these super rich or super famous or super powerful people. They have some evidence on them of some sort. Like, what was the goal? What was the end goal of Epstein's plan? And also, how do you rationalize, like, obviously they were very bad to young girls who were involved?
Yeah, well, it was a blackmail operation with a lot of high-level political officials, a classic blackmail operation. That was the first part. The second part was Epstein was providing the needs of some twisted elites and even some in government, providing their kind of twisted needs. And at the same time, he was a Mossad CIA asset collecting pretty damning bribery information. And of course, he taped everything in his mansion and everything. So there's some people out there that Epstein had on film doing nasty, illegal things.
Why was it then decided, okay, let's put this guy in jail? B, what do you think about, did he kill himself or was he killed? And C, do you think they're ever going to release kind of the client list?
I don't think they'll ever release the client list because of the clients that are on that list. And in terms of Epstein's so-called suicide, I'm convinced that was a murder. For several reasons. Bill Barr, of course, was the attorney general supposedly monitoring that case, Epstein's case, when he was in prison. Barr never once contacted the prison to check, even by phone, on how Epstein was doing. And Bill Barr, a lot of people probably don't know, Bill Barr has CIA connections going back at least 2 decades, has worked for the CIA before without question. So Barr is directly connected with the CIA, and you can document that. You can search that and find that pretty easily. The warden of that prison after this, if you would say it was a horrible lapse in security and several coincidences happening at the same time, the warden, who should have been checking on Epstein constantly, didn't. And then after Epstein, in my view, was killed, Bill Barr promoted that warden as regional director of another prison area in a new region.
And is it unusual that he promoted that warden in the sense that, should the warden's a high up guy, like, should the warden have been checking on Epstein on a regular basis? And also, do promotions happen just on a regular basis? Like, what I'm saying is, was it just business as usual that he was promoted, or was it unusual that he was promoted?
It was unusual. He should have been reprimanded because you had one of the most high-level, high-risk prisoners in years. And he was a very, very critical figure. You should be checking on him at least weekly to make sure that he's okay waiting for his trial. But they didn't. And the security lapses that have been reported, which if you put them all together, you could go that route. That's fine. But if you go back to look at all the other facts, it's pretty clear that Barr was involved, the warden was involved, and Epstein was shut up because he was a bribery asset of Mossad and the CIA, and he did have pretty damning information on some political figures.
And so you think the list will never be released because there's never going to be a group in power that won't have some incentive to keep it private.
It will only be released. That's exactly right. It will only be released if we get an administration that demands that it is. Now, people need to understand, let's get into the CIA and find those records. Most of the time, like the Kennedy assassination and other things, the CIA will destroy all those records before Congress even asks for them. So just my opinion, I don't think they'll ever release that list. And I think it's because of who's on that list. And I think it may include a president.
Yeah. So you were in the CIA for 17 years. You saw a lot of things. You've been involved in a lot of posts. You were pretty involved in a lot of different activities and the stories in the book. You mentioned that William Barr was also probably in the CIA. I was at a family event once, and a bunch of people in their 80s were talking to each other, and they turned to another person in their 80s and says, "Oh, you were in the CIA also, right?" And he was like, No, I wasn't in the CIA. Why did you think that?" And these other two guys were saying, "Oh, it's just everybody from our group kind of went into the CIA for a little while," meaning basically people who are now in their 80s or 90s and who went to Harvard or Yale, they all kind of had spent their time in the CIA.
A lot of them did, yeah.
And then they all became extremely successful businessmen.
Yeah, what a coincidence. It's a revolving door. You get that CIA clearance and you're involved in some of those operations, which of course you can't talk about, but you've got that access, that clearance and those connections in the CIA. You could walk into Lockheed Martin and demand your salary from them. So it's very valuable.
And so when did you start to, and you talk about this in the book, but when did you start to first not feel as patriotic as you once did?
Yeah, well, I was a dedicated officer. I was a Category 1 officer, and I don't want to confuse that with Tier 1. I was on, and I can't say the exact name, but I've been told to call it Anti-Terrorism Assault Team is what I'm told I'm supposed to say. But we were sent out to counter the New People's Army in Manila, who were killing a lot of Americans and embassy people. So I was a very dedicated officer to the agency. I went in under Ronald Reagan. It was my patriotic duty. I wanted to serve my country, and everything was going great. I'd received several awards. And then I was doing an international investigation on the CIA's computer networks with some of our allied governments. And the officer before me, who was just rotating out, said, "Look, there's something here that it's probably nothing, but you may want to check it out." And then she rotated to her new assignment, and she probably should thank God she did. So I said, "Okay, I'll look into it." So I looked into it, started doing some deep digging, and found that you could go into the visa section of any U.S. embassy in the world, to the unclassified visa section. That includes foreign intelligence officers and others. Go into that system and identify our covert CIA officers overseas, chief of stations, undercover officers, and most notably their assets for assassination, whatever. So the more I investigated, the more I found that it was true, shockingly. So I presented it to.
So I just want to understand. So you're saying anybody can go into an embassy? Like, what do you mean? How can people access this?
Yeah,
information?
They sit down in the visa section at the computers in the visa section, unclassified open computers that any foreign national can go in and sit down allegedly to apply for a visa. Well, they can search on through there and actually identify our covered people. And I submitted my detailed report to senior CIA officers, and they balked at it. I said, well, "Okay, fine. We'll do some more research." I did, found out it was even stronger. I sent it to the office involved in this vulnerability and said, "Listen, to the division chief, executive officer, you probably should look at this. If this is true, this is pretty serious." "Okay, we'll look at it." I called him a week later and said, "Did you see my report?" "What report?" I said, "Well, the one I sent you through documented CIA internal mail, that report." No, we must not have received it." I said, "Okay, well, I'll tell you what, I'll hand carry it over to you." So I took it over to headquarters, into CIA headquarters, up to that division, handed it to the executive officer, said, "Here's a copy of the report. Would you please give this to your division chief?" She kind of ruffled and said, "Okay." I walked out thinking, geez, what is going on here? Called her a week later. "So what did the chief think about my report?" "What report?" I said, "Ma'am, the one I handed you over your desk." She goes, "Oh, I don't remember any report." Then my report was deleted from the server inside CIA headquarters, just wiped off, vanished. I received a phone call from the division chief threatening me to drop the investigation or it would be my career. And I was like, what on earth is going on here? Well, my report was leaked outside the CIA to the Department by a good high-level officer. It was leaked to the Department of State Senior IG Inspector General's group. They looked at my report, called me over there and said, listen, we think there's something here. Let us look further and we'll get back to you. I get a phone call, golly, a couple of days later, this is Jim so-and-so. We looked at your report. We think there may be something potentially serious here. We're going to travel around the world to embassies, go to the visa section and see if this can be done. He said, keep your head low. Don't tell the CIA anything about this. And you'll probably get a call from us in about 3 months. And I was like, good, over to you. 3 months later, I get a call on the secure line. Kevin, this is Jim. We did our investigation. It's worse than even you thought. There's a meeting this Friday at Department of State IG headquarters on the upper floor. Would you be there? And I said, yes, sir, I'll be there. So I go to the meeting and I walk in and there's Jim who says, yeah, Kev, come on and sit down. And we walk in this big conference room with this long walnut table. I sit on one side of the conference room table. Jim sits on the other. The two senior IG guys sit at the end of the table. And they said, just hold on for a couple of minutes. We have someone coming. There's a buzz on the door. They go open the door, bring in the chief of the division that threatened me, the division that destroyed my documents. And they ordered him to sit at the end of the table. And the chief IG official stood up and said, consider this an official rebuke by the Department of State for putting the lives of CI officers undercover overseas at risk for over 10 years. We are going to put this in a report, and this will be published. What the CIA has done and the cover-up will be published to the entire intelligence community. So they publicly rebuked him for...
They fixed the problem, though?
Well, that's if you read the book, it gets strange. First of all, why didn't they fix it in the first place? And you could do, there's all kinds of theories you could develop about that. But goodness, it was probably after the report was issued to the IC and the CIA was publicly rebuked and embarrassed in front of the entire intelligence community. I remember walking out of that meeting thinking, well, that's the end of my career. I knew that I had a proverbial laser dot on my back, So a month later, I get a phone call, Kevin, you need to come over to headquarters immediately, and we have a meeting about your report. Oh, yes, sir. I'll be there. I show up. They show me the office. I walk in this big office with no furniture, nothing on the walls, just the old steel government kind of desk. And standing in front of it was Ted Shackley, who was supposed to be retired long ago. And he was kind of like the dark side of the CIA, running the private CIA organization, running drugs for money. And, there's Ted Shackley standing there. And I knew who he was. And I said, yes, sir. He goes, Kevin, he yells at me. He goes, I just want you to know that we're going to fix this problem. Do you understand? I said, yes, sir. Yeah, that's great. He goes, we're going to fix this problem. I said, yes, sir. He goes, that will be all. And I walked out thinking, weird. Why didn't they go to the director of security or to information security or somebody or the director of the CIA? Why Ted Shackley, the darkest figure in the CIA? And then later I was appointed to a secret base, put in a house they knew was contaminated.
Well, I have a question about this issue, though, and this is what I was wondering. So what possible reason could they have for doing this kind of cover-up or not wanting to explore this report? Is it that they didn't want to get in trouble, that they realized they made a mistake, but they didn't want anyone to notice it so nobody would get in trouble? Or did they want those asset names to be out there so that their assets would be at risk to foreign governments? Or was it misinformation, perhaps, that they were knowingly letting out there? Like, what was the story, you think?
Well, those are great questions. I think it's either A or B, covering abhorrent negligence. But I provided a report where they could have fixed that negligence, which they didn't. They covered it up and then threatened me, and eventually for the rest of my career. And the book goes into what they did to me later. They could have fixed it then, but they didn't. So why didn't they fix a problem they knew was there before all this happened and before State IG took it over? That's the $6 million question. Are they that afraid to be outed on a huge problem of negligence? Possibly. Did they want this vulnerability there for some mind-blowing reason? Possibly. And I'll give you my best answer to that question. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like there's a lot of crazy stuff that happens in the book. Like, and you're about to describe, what happens to you next. Like, you get assigned, to this base in San Antonio and shit happens.
Yeah. Did it ever? Yeah, the first thing they did is I went over to the director of operations doing some human collection and had cover while I was doing that. Well, I went over to a war zone in the middle of a lot of terrorist activity, and I was doing some operational work up there, and the people in the embassy, quote unquote, put a new student in the class that I was training how to tactically shoot. And I stood right next to me with a loaded pistol, shooting bottles and breaking in them at 25 yards. So I sent in my report on this guy. I said, hey, this guy, this and that. And I got this scathing report back, not from the division that engaged in the vulnerability we're talking about, but I get a scathing report back from another CIA division saying, do you know who this guy is? He's an Iranian assassin. What are you doing training an Iranian assassin? And I said, whoa, 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 whoa. You guys, somebody put him in my class. So over to you on that one. And the guy could have shot me anytime. Well, it got worse than that. When I got back, I found out that the division that did the vulnerability cover-up did not put me undercover. I was an open CIA officer standing right next to an Iranian assassin and not even knowing either one.
So I was trying to understand that. What does it mean that they didn't put you undercover? That means you were out there in this foreign country and it was known that you were, like, your job was as listed as CIA agent, or like, what does that mean?
Well, I went to most of the assignments I did, and I've got to be careful here, of course, when I say most of the assignments that I did, when you collect human intelligence and you're overseas and director of operations, you're undercover. I mean, that's well known for your own good. They won't just kill you. They'll torture you horribly. So in previous ones, I'd gone over there, and of course, I was undercover, and we were in the middle of terrorist groups and some war zones and things, and we were protected by our cover. Now, of course, I can't say what that was. In this particular case, I should have been under that cover, but the division responsible left me open as an open employee. Anybody could have, any Iranian intelligence office could have done an easy open source search and found out I was a CIA officer. So I came back. But I just shocked, but I filed that into the stupid file, an idiotic file. Then they placed me on a secret base inside the United States in a house they knew was badly contaminated. The people before were so sick they had to evacuate them. They put us in that house, and my wife and oldest son especially became seriously ill, almost terminal. And I asked the base to do a test on the house. They refused. I asked them to contact headquarters and Office of Medical Services and get my family tested, and they refused. I was ordered not to communicate with headquarters at all about what was going on. And it turns out the house was infested with this horrible black mold in the walls, and there were mustard gas shells percolating up in the yard that my sons were finding. And if you look up the symptoms of that kind of toxic exposure, they were identical. Anyway, so I filed suit, and I'll make this as succinct as possible. So when they refused to test the house, they refused to get our family tested. I secretly flew, especially my son primarily in this case, out to a well-known immunologist and did a battery of immune system tests on him. And the doctor's response, when it was all said and done 3 days later, said, Mr. Shipp, all I can tell you is your son's immune system is so damaged, it's like someone that's been exposed to a burst of radiation. And I said, what? He goes, that's just what his immune system looks like. So we took him to another immunologist in that particular state without the CIA knowing it. And she did a battery of tests and said, I think your son has AIDS. And we said, well, to our knowledge, and a parent never knows, but he's never dated. And they said, well, you need to get him tested for AIDS. So for 2 weeks, my oldest son suffered thinking somehow he got AIDS and he was going to die. We did the AIDS tests, got the results back in 2 weeks. It was not AIDS. His immune system had been exposed to an extreme toxin, which this lady said could be terminal. His immune system was so bad. My wife was bruising all over her body. Her gums were bleeding. Eventually, she wound up in bed with dementia, with severe headaches. They did MRIs and CTs and couldn't find anything, and it just got worse and worse and worse. So finally, I filed suit against the CIA, a personal injury suit, to get them to do something, and that's when the fun started. This all wound up in me writing my primary book before this one, From the Company of Shadows. And in that book, I put all of this in there, the doctor's diagnosis, the blood test results, the environmental company I hired, testing and the conclusion that the house was badly contaminated. I put that in From the Company of Shadows, and the CIA publications. Well, now it's called, it used to be the PRB, now it's the Publications Classified Review Board. The CIA took that and they redacted or blacked out everything, all of the evidence in my case. None of it was classified. All of it was open source. It was a violation of Executive Order 12356, which says the CIA cannot redact things simply because it reveals criminal activity. So they violated that one, and it just got worse and worse from there. Our house was broken into on the base. A chemical was painted on the ceiling where we found evidence of some of the toxins. Yeah, my attorney at the time, and I got my attorney cleared. Since I had the authority, I got my attorney cleared before the CIA knew it, because they would have forced me to have their own CIA, which is what they do. Anyway, I got him cleared, and we were back. We found this chemical with an ultraviolet light, which they didn't realize I had or was going to do. And we found that they'd painted brushstrokes of this invisible chemical on the ceiling where we'd found mycotoxins leaking in this case, the closet of our master bedroom.
So your theory is that the CIA, because of this earlier, you uncovering some problems and other things, your theory is that the CIA, basically somebody at the CIA wanted you dead.
Yes. And even more evidence. I left the CIA, became a program manager for Department of State Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program. I was actually managing the Hamid Karzai protective detail while the CIA was giving him bags of cash to give to warlords. Yeah, there's no question about it. When you put all the puzzle pieces together, one of the primary ones, I'm at an offsite with this particular Beltway Bandit Corporation, sitting there, and one of the former CIA IG officials had left and was now working for this company. We were program managers. It was a celebration in Arizona. He comes over and sits down at my table, and I said, Larry, hey, man, I haven't seen you in a while. He goes, listen, Kevin, there's something I need to tell you. And I said, what? He goes, I just wanted to say how sorry I am for what the CIA did to you and what the CIA IG did to you. We were ordered by the director to silence you and to stop you, because I had reported all this to the IG. We were ordered to silence you and stop you from your story, because the CIA was so afraid that people would find out what was buried on that base and what had happened on that base. His name was Larry. I'm not going to mention his last name. He's probably retired by now, but they could track him down pretty easily. So I was going to write a book. I decided not to, just let it go. And then I looked at it from kind of an aerial view and put all these pieces together. And it was like, goodness gracious. And this all resulted in the book, Twilight of the Shadow Government. Excuse me. And because they had redacted damning information against him in front of the company of shadows, I knew that they were probably going to redact most of Twilight of the Shadow Government, or keep it for years, which is what they do. They have no oversight in that whatsoever. So I made the personal decision, after a lot of thought, a lot of prayer, a lot of calculation, that this had to be done. And I violated my CIA NDA, and I hired a ghostwriter. I submitted the whole thing to the CIA, so they knew what I was writing. They had it for 3 months. And in 3 months, I submitted to the publisher and said, let's go. And Skyhorse published it, and now it's out. So I took a personal risk, which I still think was the right thing to do, and always will, to get the truth out to the American people and what the CIA is and what it does without Congress knowing it, or anyone else. They blocked Congress from my case completely. And I want the American people to know the unbridled power the CIA has and uses of secrecy. And one of the final parts of the chapter in the book, I give 12 steps to reform the CIA back to what Truman originally intended, and get rid of this unbridled power of secrecy that the CIA has to even use cutouts to spy on American citizens with impunity. And I call in the book at the very end, number 12, the most important one is there's got to be an avalanche of public demand for reform of the CIA and pressure on their congressmen and senators to do something about it, or nothing is going to get done. And
I feel like there was an attempt for that in the church subcommittees in the 70s.
Yes.
But it didn't really, there was outrage from the public, but and this is not a criticism, Americans have the luxury of nothing happening with their outrage. They don't care, really.
Yeah, that's the classic case. Frank Church was threatened by the CIA. You publish this and it'll be the end of you. Well, he was my understanding, he's a very straight, upstanding guy personally, and he went ahead with it with the church committee. And that was, they found just the tip of the iceberg, just the tip, just enough to show the American people what the CIA had been doing behind the scenes. It was pretty horrific stuff. And you know what came out, MK Ultra, the Assassination program, and Operation Mockingbird, and others. Well, sure enough, Frank Church's career was destroyed, and he lost his reelection when he was a favored candidate. So congressmen and senators today know that to do another church-style committee or an investigation of the CIA will result in the ruin of their career. They know that. And if you look at the intelligence committees, 20 members of those committees own stock in some of these military industrial contractors and CIA contractors like Lockheed Martin. So Congress is not going to do anything unless the American people order them to do it or they fire them.
It's almost like they should just start the CIA from scratch. And like you said, get back to what Truman originally intended,
Yes.
which is we have people in foreign countries who gather information and potentially recruit assets. And that's it. They're not really that operational.
Right.
They're supposed to be information gatherers.
And the DIA under the Pentagon is already doing all of that. And the DIA and the CIA, of course, are enemies because the CIA is doing what the DIA thinks it should be doing. And my proposal is that move the covert side, that side you just mentioned, over to the DIA and leave the good parts of the CIA intact, like the Directorate of Intelligence, the DI. They do brilliant, and I was trained by the DI. They do brilliant analytical work. And the NRO satellite program, brilliant work there. The DI analysts analyze satellite imagery, and it is just remarkable what they can find from a satellite picture. So keep the good parts of the CIA that Truman intended and eliminate this rogue part of the CIA that under secrecy, without even Congress knowing it, are doing these illegal covert operations.
So, there's all these theories, and this is the title of your book, Twilight of the Shadow Government. There's all these theories in different administrations that there's really some behind the scenes group that's running things. So, and it could be under the Republicans, like under Reagan, there was theorized, Oliver North and others were part of this shadow government. And now under the Biden administration, people point to the Clintons and Obama and others as being part of this shadow government now running things. And I'm wondering, A, if that's true, and B, if the CIA itself, like guys like Ted Shackley that you mentioned earlier, are really, guys like that, obviously not anymore him, but, guys like that are really running the CIA as opposed to, whoever the current president picks to run things. There's a real group that's actually running things.
Yeah, the CIA, the dark programs are run at the top, and with the really, especially with like Iran-Contra, the illegal ones, there's maybe 4 or 5 senior CIA officials that even know about it. I was an agent on William Casey's protective detail. My command post was in his house and outside his office on the 7th floor and driving the motorcades. None of us there with that kind of access and proximity knew that Casey had secretly engaged in a meeting with the Saudi prince to kill an imam with a car bomb. And so it was all set up. The CIA set the whole thing up and next to a mosque, and there was a girls' school there, and the imam walked out, and the CIA said, okay, and detonate in 10 seconds. Well, the imam turned around to go answer one of his patrons' questions. It's too late. The bomb was already triggered. It exploded and killed 64 women and girls in that school, and it turns out that it was the wrong imam. So none of us that close to the director had any idea that sort of program was going on. So at the very, very top, below that in the CIA workforce, you will meet some of the finest, most patriotic people you could ever know that are in there.
But I have a question though about this, like that one situation. Why didn't they just get a sniper, for instance? And then the other question is, there's got to be a bunch of people who are involved. Why do we never really hear from any of these other people who might have been involved on either the Saudi side or the U.S. side? Like, where's all the people? Where's all the bodies?
Oh, that's a great question, because I did a program, Where Are the Whistleblowers? Every CIA officer is put under a CIA secrecy agreement, which threatens civil and criminal penalties if you reveal any operation. Secret, confidential and above, up to top secret. If you reveal any of those, the CIA could put you in prison. And that's why my decision to write Twilight of the Shadow Government and intentionally violate my NDA to get the truth out put me at such risk. No one in the CIA is not only going to come out and blow the whistle on these things, because they know that the CIA will hit them with criminal penalties. Congress, who is also threatened with criminal penalties by the CIA for their clearances, are not going to do a thing about it. And the good case is John Kiriakou, who they put in jail for 2 years. I know John. John was a top performing officer. He is no criminal. But everybody in the CIA that's involved in these operations know that their freedom is at stake if they say anything about some of the horrific things they've seen.
And so, again, like, it's hard to know who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. You really describe in a very interesting way about Bob Woodward. So for people who are listening who don't know, Bob Woodward was part of the journalist team in the early 70s, Woodward and Bernstein, as featured in the movie All the President's Men, starring Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman. And they were basically these amazing journalists who broke big parts of the Watergate story and ultimately led to Richard Nixon's resignation only a year and a half after he had the biggest reelection in U.S. history. And he was a very popular president. And then suddenly he was disgraced and fell from power. And Woodward, as you point out, was this nobody journalist who suddenly had, like, you know, the assistant head of the FBI leaking information to him. Like, he suddenly rose to the top of the biggest paper on the planet.
Sure
and was given all this information to basically bring Nixon down. And you make a compelling case that he was an intelligence officer.
Yes, I think factually that is correct. And this all started when I was an agent in the hot seat outside William Casey's hospital room when he had terminal brain cancer. Woodward claims that he got past security. It's in his book, Veil. You probably read it.
I remember him. It starts off with Casey's last words, basically.
Yeah. That is a complete fabrication. We were right outside Casey's room. The agents on duty at the time, Woodward tried to get in. They caught him and they showed him the exit, and he never tried again. That is a complete fabrication. Now, if Woodward fabricates something that historically important, will he fabricate other things? You bet he will. And the more I dug, and I remember Woodward used to come and visit William Casey often, a journalist, because Casey hated journalists. I mean, everybody knew that. But Woodward would constantly visit Casey, and they've have these meetings behind closed doors in the director's office. And we were like, what the heck? This is Bob Woodward, man. Well, if you dig into it, Bob Woodward had a top secret clearance going all the way back to when he was Navy. He's been connected to intelligence for decades. And all of a sudden,
how do you know that?
I know that. Yeah, I know that. If you read Twilight of the Shadow of Government, Kent Heckenlively, my courageous co-author, and I get into detail proving that with statements from his commanders when he had the clearance on down. There's no question about it.
You mentioned how he was reporting even to Alexander Haig back then, who ended up being Reagan's chief of staff.
That's a fact. Yes. And when I decided I was going to go public with my story, I went to the Washington Post. Of course, that's a self-correcting mistake. But I went to the Washington Post and to blow the whistle, I'm not going to mention the journalist's name because they were really pressuring him with the story. And he kept telling me that his editor kept telling him to come back and ask me questions, and the answers were all classified. They were trying to get me for 30 days. They tried to get me to give answers that were classified, and I wouldn't do it. And he would say, well, my he's just pressuring me. And I'm like, this is not going to happen. So finally I said, look, I've had enough. I got the New York Times waiting for this story. Pony up or I'm going to Charlie Savage. Well, no, this is going to be my career. And he was just distraught. Well, his editor, quote unquote, still wouldn't let him do it. So I went to Charlie Savage. He published it in the New York Times. Well, guess who one of the editors of the Washington Post was then? Bob Woodward. So, and I know for certainty that Woodward had no idea. Everybody on CI's, on the director of the CI's protective detail, everybody had a cover. Nobody could come out and say what they were doing and where they were doing or that they were on Case's detail or anything. So Woodward thought no one would be able to come out and counter his story until I had my cover removed and came out factually as a witness and brought it forward. And then when Woodward was challenged about it, he said, well, I don't really remember. Bob Woodward is a fabricator. And I think we proved that in the book. And it's something I think Americans should read. I am really promoting the book for Skyhorse and Kent Heckenlively. It appears that the CIA will probably come after me and take my royalties from the book. So I'm promoting the book, promoting them, and just promoting factually the things that people need to know. And that's why I came out and wrote this.
And what do you think? What do you think is the relationship between the government and events right now and the CIA? And you talk a little bit about this in towards the end of the book as well.
Yeah, we did at the very last minute, the book is ready to be published. We were asked to put my analysis of the Butler, Pennsylvania assassination attempt on Donald Trump. And there are all kinds of theories floating around out there. lot of people make theories. They don't have evidence, there was a lot of that floating around. So I just did my analysis, and the analysis was it was gross negligence on the part of the Secret Service. It wasn't the CIA. It wasn't a hit. It wasn't the deep state. It was gross negligence on the part of the Secret Service. And this is just my opinion. I think they put Donald Trump at the bottom of the list for protective resources for whatever reasons. It was clear that day because they pulled two ladies from DHS who had no protective operations experience. Those are the videotapes we saw of them running around not knowing what to do. So he was placed at the bottom of the list for resources. But my analysis was this is one of the gross missteps of Secret Service in their history, second to JFK.
And, one line of questioning that was happening right after the assassination attempt was, would he be allowed to kind of stand up and communicate to the audience after being hit like that?
Well, yeah, people are politicizing that for that cause, which I am directly against. They forget that a loving father, fireman, was mortally killed in that assassination attempt in front of his daughters, who he laid on to protect. They leave that out, and I stay apolitical. I don't go Trump. I don't go Harris. I don't go there. And sometimes I think there's a uniparty. But anyway, the fact of the matter is, using that event and ignoring the fireman that was killed and the other people injured is political theatrics, and I think it's morally reprehensible.
And right now, would you say how many, what are some of the types of things that we might not know in the U.S. that we should know?
Wow. Well, the ones that I got out, of course, it is in the book. And I make a distinction between the shadow government and the deep state. People say there is a deep state. People say there isn't a deep state. And the first program I did on YouTube, actually I did it before an audience and it was put on YouTube, was called Shadow Government Deep State. And I make a distinction between the shadow government and the deep state. The shadow government would be the CIA and its manipulation of our elected government, Congress, the White House, and the judiciary. And I get into that in that speech, for which I thought I'd be arrested the next day, but I wasn't. I get into how that works. The deep state, people say it doesn't exist. Well, the deep state are these massive military industrial contractors and what I call the secret intelligence industrial complex that literally set foreign policy for the United States on behalf of the CIA with their CIA contracts and their military industrial complex contracts. That's the deep state, in my view, in conjunction with the Department of State and other things that are running an unelected government and setting foreign policy with no input from the American people.
And, is this something, obviously, is this something we should be concerned about? Has this been going on all along and it's just business as usual? What are some of the things they run that maybe is even beyond what the president might know?
Well, from the very beginning up until now, the CIA has used these corporations to constantly engage in foreign wars, constantly, over and over. And we see Ukraine. John Brennan, the director of the CIA, was making secret trips into Ukraine to help them build and do the coup of 2014. The CIA was involved in that. There is so much. That's why I wrote this book and why I call for reform in the end. Things like that and all of the other things we document in the book the CIA has done without the people knowing is so dastardly and disturbing and horrific in some cases. And the people, they're using $39 billion, that's an estimate, the CIA is, of our tax dollars to do these things. And Americans have no idea that unelected officials are causing constant wars. That's big business. Vietnam was $1 trillion for the CIA and the contractors, for example. So they make a lot of money off this, and they make a lot of money off wars and coups. Countries that have oil, like Iran, when they ruined Iran to keep Iran's oil, the CIA did.
In what way? What did they do in Iran?
In Iran, they went in there, and the democratically elected president at the time decided that he didn't want America to have free access to Iran's oil anymore, that he wanted to nationalize it so Iran could make profits off their own oil. Well, the CIA did not want that to happen. That meant billions of dollars in oil profits. So the CIA engaged in and staged a coup, overthrew him and replaced him with the Shah, their puppet, who was, excuse my French, he was a moron, put him in power, enabled him to live a lavish lifestyle. The people were enraged by his palace living, so they threw him out and elected current regime, the Khomeini and the Iranian government, which is now the chief sponsor of terrorism in the entire world. That was all started by the CIA. These are the blunders that they do because they have no oversight, because what they do is in secret.
Now, it seems like and you describe various things in this book ranging from, we talked about the Nixon impeachment, but also the Kennedy assassination you talk about in the book, and we don't have to, people could read about that in the book. But how do you, it seems like, Kennedy and Nixon were on opposite sides of each other. So what side is the CIA on then, or this deep state or whatever? Why were they against both?
So the CIA is on one side only, and that's its own side, and self-perpetuation and concealment of the illegal drug running and arms running and things that they have done. They're on their own side. They want promotion and expansion of the CIA, and any White House that doesn't get in line with that, then they will start engaging in covert activities to bring that particular president down, which I think is pretty clearly what they did to Nixon. And in conjunction with the mafia, they did to JFK. So the CIA is a global juggernaut that functions with the power of secrecy and manipulates our government, Congress, the judiciary with the state secrets privilege and FISA and other things, and manipulates the White House, like Iran-Contra, where George W. Bush, longtime CIA officer, which he tried to conceal. He'd been with the CIA as an officer for decades. George W. Bush's vice president was the CIA in the White House, and he ran the Iran-Contra affair, which is illegal without Congress's knowledge. That's just a classic example. You're not
talking about George W. Bush. You're talking about George H.W.
Yeah,
Bush.
I'm sorry, George H.W. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Because he was the director of the CIA in the 70s, and then suddenly was vice president.
Yeah, he was director of the CIA for 6 months. I met him up on the 7th floor with Casey when Reagan visited. And nice, congenial man, likable man. Well, that's a classic CIA agent, no question about it. But when I dug deeper, I found out that his connections to CIA go all the way back to Zapata oil, back just after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he becomes 6 months with the CIA, and he claims that's the only time he had with the CIA, which is a lie. And he winds up in the White House running an illegal operation. Did Reagan know or not know? In my opinion, Reagan didn't know the extent of what Bush was doing. That's just my opinion. When he found out, it was like oh gosh moment, but that's just my opinion. But no question that George H.W. Bush, longtime CIA officer, was operating Iran-Contra illegally out of the White House. Then he becomes president, and the CIA is in the office of the president. I think I talk about that in the book. And people don't know that. They don't realize that is what was going on. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this.
And why didn't Reagan just throw Bush under a bus then? Reagan didn't like Bush to begin with. Why'd they kind of just all put the blame on Oliver North doing it in secret? I guess maybe it questions his judgment if he blames, his vice president. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've got my own opinions on that. I know President Reagan distanced himself totally from William Casey after that, and he was his campaign manager, and they were friends, and he stopped communicating with him totally, which I thought, well, that's peculiar. So, Reagan had to protect his presidency, which it would have gone down if he hadn't just come out openly like he did and admit the quote-unquote mistake. And all the American people want to know is the truth and an apology in most cases. And that's what he did. He was not the perpetrator of Iran-Contra. It was George H.W. Bush and Oliver North, who I have met, and he's told some fibs, and he was doing something illegal, and they were running guns. There's no question about it. And they all got off, which is typically what happens with a high-level CIA official when they do something naughty.
And, I guess they weren't, and hopefully aren't, still powerful enough to sway elections, because George H.W. Bush was defeated by Clinton, for instance. And it seems like the level of power of this deep state isn't that high enough to sway elections, although you never know.
I think it still is, frankly, that they are and they do. For example, I wrote an article for the Blaze News. I don't know if you read that, but in the Blaze News, I talk about that, the CIA's influence on elections in the White House. And 42 high-level, one was assistant director of the CIA, came out, 42 of them signed a declaration saying Hunter Biden's laptop was disinformation. They knew it was not, but they signed that to stop Trump. Well, now in this election, all 42 have come out again. These are high-level CIA officials. All 42 have come out again and stated that Donald Trump is a danger to democracy, he's got to be stopped. And then, in addition to that, 741 other senior intelligence officials came out and signed the same kind of agreement. Donald Trump must be kept out of the White House. You talk about influencing an election by the intelligence community. Now they're doing it right in our face.
I mean, maybe they are legitimately worried.
I think some of them are. I do.
Mhm.
You know, I stay apolitical, but I think some of them are, and you know, I'll just stop there.
And a couple people who are going through the process of joining different three-letter agencies, maybe not the CIA, but in that community. What would you advise someone young who, wants to be a patriot? And look, obviously the intelligence community as a whole does good things. It's important. There is a role for intelligence,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
we got to make sure there's no terrorism and
Yes.
no 9/11 and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you tell people?
Well, they can join the CIA. Just be careful what part of the CIA they get in. If they get in the director of operations, they tried to get me to go to the DO overseas collecting human. And when I turned it down, they told me my career was over. But when they go on the operations side, they're there for life. And what they see and what they do, and I know case officers personally who were sick with what they were doing and they wanted out. So you could go into the CIA.
What were they doing? What were they doing?
Well, I
that they
can't
were
say
sick
what they
of?
were doing. I was out with them doing it. Well, let's put it this way. You lie, you cheat, you steal. Some of them engage with prostitutes. You're an alcoholic. You do things morally that you have to eliminate morals in your thinking that they do. And this James Bond slick CIA type case officer, it couldn't be farther from the truth. Some of them are some of the lowest snakes I've ever met. So if you're going to join the CIA, go. The Director of Intelligence is an awesome branch, man. Go there. That's a fulfilling career. It's fascinating. There's the Director of Science and Technology. Go there. The Director of Administration, there's positions there. So there's things they can do, but I would say stay away from the dark side.
I mean, how do you know though until it's too late?
Well, you don't. That's the thing. I had no idea. When I got hired, I was like, dude. And then I wound up being the senior briefer to new people coming in. I had no idea what I was going to be doing. And later on, I wound up in the field, undercover, doing human operations and seeing the dirty side of things. So no, sadly, because of the dome of secrecy, they're not going to know. Now, there's one branch that I champion, and that's the Security Protective Service, the top secret cleared federal police service of the CIA, which is newly created around 85 or so. That's a great bunch. They're fantastic. And if somebody, even if without a degree, you could get into the Security Protective Service, become a federal police officer with a top secret clearance, you're able to go places in the CIA no one else can go. And there's an example of a good thing to join.
Well, what do they do?
This is their statement. Their mission is to protect CIA personnel and facilities around the world. And there's a wide latitude for that. And I was chief of training for that police force, and they are extremely well trained. They're trained not just in police tactics, counterterrorism tactics, but also in intelligence. So they're fantastic. And what they do is clean. They protect people. They protect facilities that are under a terrorist threat and things like that. It's a noble goal.
Yeah, that seems really important. And, one other thing I want to talk about, I was a day trader and hedge fund manager in 2001 for many years, but I'm talking specifically about 9/11. And everybody knew the day after 9/11 that somebody was shorting huge and buying puts huge
Right.
on the airlines.
Yeah.
And you talk about this in the book.
Yeah.
How come it seems like that's something that's easy to track, and you give some tracking, but then the trail stops.
Yeah.
Right. So you talk about this in the book. You have a story about it. You talk about Alex Brown and the former CEO there. But why does the trail stop? It's all electronic. We have the information. Why wasn't anybody arrested for simply shorting the airlines huge, or questioned at least for shorting the airlines on September 10th?
Oh, that is such a great question. And as you know, I tracked Buzzy Krongard was the one who was behind the attempt to silence and destroy me and with my family as collateral damage. Buzzy Krongard is in the book, exactly the chapter you're talking about. And Alex Brown was a pretty corrupt organization we get into in detail. But Buzzy Krongard short sold his stock just a few days before 9/11 hit. And he is mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report, which left out, I was a criminal investigator. The 9/11 report was not a criminal investigation at all. and it left out some important things. If you look at the footnote, it talks about a certain day trader that short sold before the attack in a footnote, and that person was Buzzy Krongard.
And did he know, like, how, like, okay, this is where it starts to, like, my conspiracy theory radar starts to go off, that it couldn't be, because again, if people knew, then a lot of people had to know somehow, and it would be, 20 years later, people would know that other people knew. Like, somebody would say on their deathbed, oh, I got to get this off my chest, I knew about 9/11 beforehand.
The deathbed, maybe, like E. Howard Hunt. But other than that, they don't want to go to prison. They're not going to say a thing. And we follow in the book, I do, the evidence, period. I don't make any conclusions about Buzzy Krongard or any conspiracy. I mean, they're going to call me conspiracy theorist. That's what they do. That's why there's so much evidence and documentation in the book, including my own performance appraisals in the CIA for people who claim I never worked there. So I know that's coming, and it will come. But this book is documented with footnotes in that regard in terms of Krongard and the short sells. And it stopped. I think we mentioned this in the chapter. We get into that in detail in the book. Buzzy Krongard didn't just start with the CIA when George Tenet, his buddy, invited him over. Krongard was with the CIA for years before he was appointed as an XO. So he wasn't just a newly Wall Street dude, the CIA has been connected to Wall Street since its formation. So he wasn't just another Wall Street dude coming into the CIA. He had a connection to the CIA for years.
Yeah, so I guess, so again, piecing together the theories, do you think he might have known something was going to happen, but he didn't alert the other parts of the CIA, or the CIA turned a blind eye to it? Like, what do you think personally happened?
If you notice, I don't go there in the book. I don't make conclusions that I can't back up with facts. And that would be one of them.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I respect that, because it seems like, I want to believe that if an organization knew what was coming, they would have done something to prevent it. And I know afterwards, I mean, the whole reason the Department of Homeland Security was formed is because that the different pieces were known by different groups within the intelligence community, and nobody was communicating. So that was kind of like the theory that survived that, historically. And, and then we kind of like think that it's incompetence as opposed to something more insidious. And I'd like to believe the maximum it is incompetence. But if someone knew enough to make money on it, then that's a little scarier.
Well, let me put it this way. I approached that like a criminal investigator, and there was a whole lot that was not investigated in the 9/11 Commission report. A whole lot. There's about 100 different things that weren't looked into that are really concerning. I point people to do their own research on what was missing from that report, what was not investigated. Strange things like they found the paper passport of one of the so-called hijackers laying on the street after the plane, everybody in it, and the building was incinerated. This passport seemed to survive, and they found it on the street. I mean, that's one of multiple things that I think people need to be aware of. Am I reaching a conclusion? No, I'm not going there. I'm already being called a conspiracy theorist. Let's just change that and say I'm a conspiracy investigator. Because I go where the facts go, even if people are going to accuse me and, hurdle defamation. I don't care, because the book is full of facts and it's documented. And that's the only place I go, is the facts, wherever they lead. And with 9/11, there's some concerning things that were never looked into.
I mean, I'm sure that's probably true. Maybe I'm kind of hopeful that it's an incompetence thing and people don't want the level of incompetence to be revealed. I do believe that these Al-Qaeda guys took over these planes and crashed them into the buildings. That, I was actually at the World Trade Center that morning, saw the first plane going in.
Yeah.
And so I really saw it happen. And I lived about 2 or 3 blocks away.
Ugh.
And so I do want to believe, again, that the most of the story that is just historically out there. But like, there are some concerning things. Like, we all knew that, I mean, everybody in the country knows that there was some shorting of the stock markets the day before and the 2 days before. And I always wondered, like, how, and people ask, like, how come that wasn't, it's so easy to trace, at least now. But even then, everything was electronic. It was all electronic records. Everything's heavily regulated. Now there's something called know your customer laws, but there was sort of the same thing back then too. it wasn't like it was a big secret who was doing things. Somebody knew.
Well,
The
they
brokers knew.
The 9/11 Commission even traced it to Buzzy Krongard, but they didn't put that in the report. He's in a footnote. So there was some tracing there. The way I approach it is this. You always start with negligence and incompetence with the government first, and then you work your way from there. I've seen the CIA do some stupid things I can never talk about. It was like the Keystone Cops. So you start with negligence there, and then you look at the facts and you see if they lead in another direction. And that's kind of what I do. Start with incompetence and then start building information that, well, maybe it wasn't just incompetence and these are the events or the facts and perhaps why. And, you're going to be attacked if you question the 9/11 report in the mainstream media. And I get into Operation Mockingbird and the manipulation of the mainstream media in the book, of course. Anybody that even questions 9/11, which I think people should, are immediately attacked as the CIA's old term, conspiracy theorists, or on and on, without addressing the facts or without addressing some of the evidence on both sides. They don't do that. And that's just the news media. When is the last time you saw a real investigative journalist report on the CIA? Not since the Church Commission. They're terrified. Most people are terrified of the CIA, and journalists know it would be the end of their career if they did that. So
I'm terrified of the CIA. I think I'm starting to think this podcast is going to get me in trouble.
Well,
you got me nervous, Kevin.
Well, and let me say this, because I get that all the time. I am the only one they can get. I signed their secrecy agreement. No one else did. They can't touch them. However, they're threatening people. They threatened Tucker Carlson. I don't know if you read that. Tucker's now really mad at him because Mike Pompeo, the director of the CIA, called him personally and said, if you continue talking about this, Julian Assange, you're going to be arrested. And one of the points I make in the book, which is I think one of the most important, is people have got to stop fearing the CIA. That's how they do it. Everybody is afraid of them. And they're like the Wizard of Oz, big, scary face, little man behind the curtain. You got to understand the little man behind the curtain so you're not afraid of the big, scary face. And as soon as Americans realize that the CIA can't touch them, especially if there's millions of us demanding reform, then they'll stop being afraid of this rogue agency. Think about it. There is an agency of the federal government that people are terrified of. Just think about that. And my favorite quote, I end a lot of my speeches on this, by Thomas Jefferson, is when people fear their government, there's tyranny. When the government fears the people, there's liberty. So they need to fear us. And I don't know whether they fear me or not, but they're certainly, I think they're certainly regretting what they did. But we need to stop fearing them. We have to, because that's their hold.
Well, Kevin, and I'll say the title again, it's Twilight of the Shadow Government, How Transparency Will Kill the Deep State. Whether or not anybody reaches the same conclusions as you or is has different opinions than you or whatever, this is an eye-opening book. You raise so many questions. You create more questions. I probably know less now about the government having read the book than I did before or read the book, but it's definitely eye-opening, and you make a lot of interesting connections and point out things that, I, who am a follower of history and so on, I didn't know anything about. So thank you so much for writing the book and for coming on the show. And if I get killed in the next few weeks, people will know why.
Hey,
blaming you.
And bring me a cake if I'm in jail, would you? No. Hey, it's been a great pleasure. It really has.
Thank you, Kevin. Same here.
All right. Thank you.